Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another session of Gather to Grow. I'm your host, Donumdu. Tonight, we're showing the ultimate summer crop guide, and I have two very amazing speakers joining me tonight. Welcome to our Spaces session on Gather to Grow. Siyabonga Velakazi.
Thank you.
Tell us a bit about yourself, where you started in the agricultural sector.
Good evening to everyone. Thank you for having me. As introduced, I'm Siyabonga Vilakazi. I'm born and bred in Pietermaritzburg, KwaZulu-Natal, and my journey started 22 years ago at Sadara College of Agriculture as a student. I did my diploma there and was employed within the Department of Agriculture. Started off as a technician at the college, working with crops and studying part-time whilst working, and worked my way all the way to a master's from Free State. Ended up lecturing agronomy and crops at Sadara, and also focused on another module called land preparation. And then in the year 2019, I was offered an opportunity, or I worked myself to an opportunity to head up to the Western Cape to Elsenburg Agricultural Training Institute as a deputy director responsible for plants and animal husbandry, and played an integral role in helping them get their new diploma underway. Then in 2021, I returned back to my home province and was back at Owen Sithole College of Agriculture in Northern Natal. Earlier this year, in April, I've managed to work my way back to Sadara College.
What an amazing journey. I think for me, it's always so interesting to see the dynamic, spaces that we all find ourselves in within the agricultural sector. And I think the education part is definitely a vital part in the growth of the sector and where people learn and grow to be able to produce the food that we eat every day. So thank you so much for your knowledge and shared experience and for being here this evening. My next guest is Dr. Lorato Matsanyane. I hope I'm saying that right, Doctor. I was practicing before. Thank you so much for being here. She was, of course, featured on the article also on Food for Mzansi that's based on this topic, sharing more insights as to the steps that you need to take in order to prepare for summer crops and summer crop season. She's, of course, from the Agricultural Research Council, and she's a geneticist by trade, and she's also now focusing on supporting small farmers. A bit about yourself, Dr. Lorato, where your journey started, and more about where your love for agriculture came from.
Thank you very much. We used to have a food garden at home, planting anything and everything that is vegetable at home. But on the formal side, as you mentioned, I started as a geneticist because my interest was on gene manipulation and how this can assist in improving livelihood. So it started in high school when my biology teacher took time off to give me extra lessons on how genetics is important in terms of manipulating anything and everything that you want to manipulate in life. I continued with that into my undergrad, and fortunately the university that I was registered at was the University of Free State, and their genetics focuses on wheat. So that's when I started branching a bit into agriculture. During my honors and masters, there was not much agriculture. It was more on genetically modified crops. In my PhD, that's when I started looking into the impact of genetically modified crops, looking into your commonly known BT maize, which is planted in South Africa, and how those type of crops improve on the livelihood of smallholder farmers, given their resistance to economically important pests. Following that, I ventured into the bigger space of smallholder farmers. That's when now I started looking at applied research, whereby I deviated a bit from the genetics part of it because it was, we call it library type of research. It was something that would only be applied in 30 plus years. You would only see the results in 30 plus years. So the focus shifted to something that could be applied within a short space of time, be it a year, be it 5, but a relatively short space of time. So I dabbled into looking at biological products, which I looked at thinking that or hoping that I would be able to afford smallholder farmers, especially those that have restrictions when it comes to capital required for production, for them to use biological products as an alternative means to protect their crops from diseases and pests. And these biologicals were prepared from common weeds And from the success of that, I then went into the biogas space, whereby we looked at waste management. But then obviously from using your fruit and veg waste, you would get a slurry at the end of that, in addition to your biogas. So I did some research whereby I looked at using the slurry that you get after producing biogas, if you were using the substrate of fruit and veg waste, how that can assist smallholder farmers that cannot afford your normal synthetic fertilizers, your NPKs. We did some experiments there and we found that they work quite well. So in order to get that technology to the farmers, I then branched into agricultural extension, collaborating with the Northwest University as well as the Gauteng Department of Agriculture, and we did some extension work until where I am now, where my main focus is farmer support, enterprise development, as well as commercialization of whatever products that are produced in the research space.
Well, all I can say in response to that is wow, wow, wow. What an amazing journey. And you've made so many amazing contributions. I actually wish I'd invited you to a session that we hosted 2 weeks ago around alternatives for farmers when it comes to fertilizers and the fact that it's rising so aggressively and how farmers are really struggling. So I think we want to do a part two on that. So I would definitely want to invite you back for that session if you're able to, ma'am. Now, we all know that the climate and farming go hand in hand. And this week, we're focusing specifically on summer crops, the planting, harvesting for new farmers. Let's start with an introduction of what farmers should know and keep top of mind as they prepare for the season. Siyabonga, can I maybe ask you to take this one? And then I'll ask Dr. Lorato to also respond to the question.
Climate and obviously what you are looking to be producing as we head into summer go hand in hand. And I think obviously climate is one of those aspects or natural resources which we need to work with in our favor. We do not necessarily always have much control over it, but we've got to try and pre-play it to such an extent that we try and master it and play along with whatever it throws at us. But I think before we get to the climate, I think they're critical things which, no matter how conducive or suitable the climate is for this oncoming season, if we don't put into place and do prior, which will always hinder our production and obviously the stability of the type of crops which we eventually select or opt to do. And I think at this time, if farmers, or no matter what scale of production they're into, are working or thinking of preparing their land, they've obviously got to look at taking a decision in terms of what they are looking to prepare and looking at the status quo, the nutrient basis of the land under which they're going to be producing, especially if it's outside in the soil. So it is at this instance whereby people should have already started or sent in their soil samples to the various soil fertility labs to get that analyzed. And as much as some people might see that or think of it as being a nuisance, I think it's critical to at least do it once a year, once a season or production season in terms of the 12 months, in order to know what is actually in the soil. And if we've obviously got a concept or an idea of what we are looking to be planting, it would obviously make that a bit more easier for us when we do our soil fertility test, in terms of the correct recommendations coming up in terms of what soil nutrients or nutrients we should be applying to get the best out of obviously the crop which we are looking to be planting. But I think the other aspect is obviously, as much as there's a lot of information or academic material which is written down in terms of the climates of various areas and so forth, you've got to be a farmer and be out there and be experiencing it. I think in the norm, a lot of people would have told you that it's appropriate to start planting your summer crops October 15, but you'll see as well with climate change that things are changing. By this time, 25, 30 years back, climate would have been so conducive to such an extent that this would have been an appropriate time that you could have started putting down your seed for your summer crops. But in a lot of instances nowadays, you're finding that we haven't quite reached those maximum temperatures or conducive temperatures to be able to put our seed down conducively. So it's also going to be essential to make sure that at the time at which we put down our seed or seedlings, for our summer seasons that at least our temperatures have at least started increasing.
Thank you so much for that. And I think that's definitely an important aspect. The way we farmed 50 years ago to the way we farm now, even 20 years ago, is not the same like we do today. So that's definitely something to consider. And I'm hoping that we can maybe break it down even further as we continue on with this conversation. Dr. Lorato, what is your take on this? And then my next question would also be specifically based on the article that we wrote where you featured on Food for Mzansi, where you explained that soil care is one of the most important aspects for a successful summer crop. And I think it's definitely what Siyabonga is highlighting. Why is this so important in your opinion?
I like what Siyabonga said, particularly in terms of planting time, because people still have the assumption that if traditionally at the end of January you'll be putting in your seeds for that season or that production cycle, you should still do the same even now. But because of the impact of climate change, it is not that way. So, like Siyabonga said, it is important for you as a farmer to pay attention to environment and obviously to follow the climatic conditions and the changes and adapt your production accordingly. So with regards to soil, as I mentioned the last time in the article, I don't know if I should say soil is to the plant as the body is to you. I don't know if I make sense. We normally say that you have one body, so make sure that you take care of it. And the way that you take care of it is you have sufficient sleep, you eat all the nutritious and healthy food that you can to make sure that you extend your longevity, meaning that you're taking care of your body. It's the same thing with soil when it comes to production, particularly crop production, because a lot of smallholder farmers have limited amount of arable land. So if one is not paying attention to soil health and soil care, it's the same as you are depleting or destroying your livelihood. So for me, taking care of your soil, doing the necessary care aspects, and not just the soil itself, but also remembering that we have the microbiome in the soil, which is the microorganisms in the soil, which are also very crucial. A lot of farmers tend to ignore that aspect and only focus on your soil pHs and your soil fertilities, looking at whatever other nutrients are in the soil, but they tend to forget that you also need to make sure that the microbiome is also healthy because it also supports your production practice. I'm not sure if I was able to capture a response to the question that you asked.
Yes, thank you, ma'am. I think you've captured it quite clearly, and it's definitely links to my next question in terms of the vital aspects that farmers need to understand when it comes to feeding your soil. Why is it so important to do that after every production cycle? I think you've basically answered my question. But Siyabonga, would you maybe like to also just contribute to what Dr. Lorato was saying, and also maybe just adding your experience in terms of, your background and what you think is best for farmers when they're preparing their soil?
In terms of what we've got to try by all means to try and replace what previous crop cycles or crops have taken out of the soil, which is obviously a critical aspect in terms of the soil sampling, which I spoke about. And obviously the manner in which we look after our soil leading up to obviously whatever we're going to be planting, the summer season crop now, is also going to have an impact. If we haven't been able to look after our soil appropriately or our production land appropriately from January to now, we can't be expecting miracles from it. If there hasn't been appropriate soil cover on our soil, you'll find that it won't be able to give us as much emphasis or good results as it was able to do the previous year. Another aspect is that we must always remember with every ton which we are getting out, I'm just making an example with a measure to unit of measuring quantity of our yield. Whatever we are bringing out or obtaining out of our land and harvesting is obviously taken away a lot of nutrient status and fertility out of the soil. So we can't just keep draining and sucking out of the soil without replenishing, which is why it becomes important that we constantly plow back what we've taken out. And obviously, with a soil sample, it's going to try and get us as close as possible to supplying or providing to the soil what is deemed necessary for the type of crop which you are going to be planting within that land. And I think there's something intriguing, which is also very important, which you touched on, at the beginning of the session, the rise in price of fertilizers. And obviously as small-scale farmers or even large-scale farmers and commercial farmers, a lot of people are feeling the pinch in terms of obviously the cost of fertilizers and so forth. So a lot of people are looking for strategies and options and different solutions to try and counteract the high cost of fertilizers, which is why it's becoming also critical to try and reduce the need for fertilizers by working with various strategies such as cover crops and plowing back in your cover crops here and there. And I think another critical aspect is that of trying to avoid monoculture and planting the same type of crop year after year within that same area, because all that it's doing, it's taking out of the soil the very same nutrients. And without us practicing a crop rotation or diversified crops or crops from different families, we are not bringing that much needed diversity within our soil, and obviously as well as adaptability with terms of climate. So it's always going to be important to obviously nurture our soil accordingly and to not neglect obviously the natural resources which are obviously given to us. And the natural resources which we are given, we've got to nurture them to such an extent that we look after them appropriately, so that even the people who find these farms or the areas which we are working now with 75 years time, 100 years time, they find it in a conducive and reasonable manner to be able to make a living out of it. So sustainability is also a key aspect in this regard.
Thank you so much.
Just
Dr.
to add
Lorato, you want to take the floor?
Yeah, no, I was actually wanted to add on to what Siyabonga was saying in terms of plowing back. One practice that one normally recommends to farmers is that they need to also dabble into using your crop and your organics. The only disadvantage for a lot of farmers that they have experience with using organic fertilizers is that they are slow releasing in terms of the nutrients, the availability of nutrients to the soil, to the plant. So a lot of farmers, if you do a trial and you plant, say, for example, one row where you plant using your synthetic fertilizers, your normal LAN or the so-called NPKs, and then the next row you plant using your organic fertilizer, you'd find that the plants that were planted using organic fertilizers grow relatively slower as compared to those that were planted using synthetic fertilizer. However, just like Siyabonga recommended, if you go back to that soil and do soil testing, you'd find that there are more nutrients in the soil which had application of organic fertilizers, because they work on rehabilitating the soil. They work on opening up the air pockets in the soil and increasing the microbiome, like I said before, which are important in synthesizing the nutrition or the nutrients in the soil. So my recommendation is, in addition to what Siyabonga is saying, with plowing back, consider using your organic fertilizers to just rehabilitate your piece of land that is just available to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lorato. And I'm going to say for the record to both of my speakers here tonight, I'm going to definitely invite you guys back to my alternatives for fertilizer and fertilizer discussion part 2, because the exact same point that you made now, Dr. Lorato, is what our previous speakers also said. We had, for example, I'm not sure if you know, Sumitra Naid is managing a food waste production management company. Dr. Piri Jr. actually, he does alternatives, and they said the exact same thing. Moving towards liquid fertilizers, we use less, and it actually goes a little bit further than your more generic fertilizers. So definitely a conversation to be had again. So I hope that I can book your time now here publicly in a very public space to join me again. Most summer crops are staple foods for consumers, both locally and internationally. Large commercial farmers' operations are founded on the production of essential summer crops such as maize, soybeans, sunflower seeds, groundnuts, peanuts, and sorghum. Can we break down some of these, main summer crops for farmers who may not be considering it, or they want to consider it, or they maybe want to rotate? What should they be focusing on? Siyabonga, do you maybe want to start with maize and soybeans, and then Dr. Lorato can also focus on the other crops? I think that would be the best approach. But you let me know how you'd like to, distribute it and actually share the information.
Firstly, Siyabonga said it earlier, crop rotation is very important. So for example, if this cycle you plant leafy crops like your spinach, The next cycle, consider planting potato or tomato. And then the next cycle, consider planting maybe onion. This is the importance of rotation. Next cycle, one can consider doing cabbage. And then the next cycle, plant legumes. Importance of legumes are that they are nitrogen fixing. So in your crop rotation system, one needs to make sure that you have legumes as part of your rotation. So I don't know if this will be beneficial to the farmers or if they already have their own production system. So you need to evaluate the weather. The weather being what's the rainfall pattern? This is dependent on whether you have irrigation or not. What are the temperatures? What are the wind speeds? I'll make an example with potato, which a lot of farmers are trying to get into because it's quite a high value crop. With potato, traditionally, planting would start end of August, but I don't know if you recall that around that time, depending on which area you're in, it was still a bit nippy. For the potato tubers to properly germinate and sprout under the ground, it needs to be moderate temperatures. So with the cold temperatures that were felt in the past couple of weeks, it would mean that you would not realize effective or 100% germination of your potato plants. In areas, currently the temperatures are playing tricks on us. There are certain areas that are now experiencing maximum of around 30 now, and it's not even December yet. So for somebody like that, planting potato now would be a waste. You would recommend that they look at a time where it's still temperate, probably even though it's not advisable, but planting from March, like in Limpopo. There, the temperatures go as high as 50 or something, I'm not sure. But then they start planting in March. These are the important things, as Siyabonga had mentioned, that look at the climatic conditions. Number two, when you're a farmer preparing for planting your summer crop, this is one of the things that I always grapple with in terms of smallholder farmers producing. You put your seed in the ground, you spend money buying your fertilizers, you irrigate, you do all sorts of things, you harvest. And now you're sitting with this beautiful harvest of potatoes, sweet potato, whichever crop, butternut, spinach, but you don't have a market. Then I go back to the farmer and ask the farmer, you were all excited. You were listening to Food from Zanzi during the interviews, and you were getting all these tips on how to take care of your soil, on how to do XYZ, but you didn't even do the most important aspect when it comes to production, which is identifying your market. And similar to what Siyabonga said in terms of climate change and its impact on production seasons, it's the same with from the notion that we're getting to a point whereby certain summer crops, the market is currently saturated with those crops or those vegetables. So it is important that before you put your seed onto the ground and spend time and money on producing, you make sure that your market is there so that all that effort that you put in will be realized when you take your crops or your produce to the market and you're able to realize a profit.
No, thank you, Doc. Just to touch on as well, critical aspect with this is to realize that obviously with the different types of crops, they have different requirements in terms of nutrient supply and their behavioral patterns in terms of how they growth and development stages they undertake. But I think a critical aspect, in order to bring out the best is obviously to make sure that on the various lands, especially with us as small-scale farmers, a lot of the small-scale farmers are not necessarily exposed or have at liberty to have large areas of land. To obviously play around or plant different types of crops from different families. I think Doc mentioned it, to obviously within the crops which you are going to alternate within your lands, to have legumes, which could be anything. I mean, from your peanuts, just like you indicated, or your soybeans, or your peas, because I think some of the aspects as well is that we must also not take for granted that there are a lot of farmers who plant just for sustainability or for subsistence. So in other words, they just produce enough to reduce the amount of feed or food which they need to buy, you'll find that they'll only buy, obviously, things such as meat, but a lot of the vegetables which they'll have within their households are grown by them. So to obviously have within your pool of crops, legumes, as well as your brassicaceas, examples, your cabbage, your broccoli, your kale, because with the different crop families or types, they're going to add different variety and play a significant role as well within the soil. To also have perhaps something along the lines under the onion family, which could be anything from your leeks or garlic, which could be anything from your potatoes, your beetroots, or your carrots. Something I want to touch on, which is also relatively significant, is that we must realize that the manner in which obviously our soils have been looked after might be vastly different to the manner in which my neighbor has looked after. So we might be within close proximity or very close to each other, even neighbors, be it neighboring farms or neighboring smallholder gardens. But you might find that what our soil needs, despite us planting the same crop, might differ greatly because of variety in terms of our soil type and obviously the manner in which our soils have been catered for, looked after in the past. So it's obviously integral to try, by all means, even if it's just once a season or once a year within your 12 months, to take a soil sample of your area because you've got an indication of an idea of what you're looking to plant. Hence, that will assist the people analyzing the soil for you at the soil fertility lab in terms of what that crop's requirements are. Then a final thing I want to touch on when responding to this is obviously with climate and how the weather has changed. We've got to move away from being recipe farmers. So people who are not going to look at their surroundings, but only take into cognizance what we read in books and not adapt to what nature and the environment throws at us. In a lot of instances, a lot of people have cast in stone that due to maize, we're being told that maize needs to be planted and put down in the soil, especially in areas which relatively get quite cold in winter. It can only be conducive to plant our maize from the 15th of October, because in the past, that's when temperature has been conducive in order for our seed to germinate. But we've also got to take into cognizance if it's a year where we've relatively had very little rainfall, a very dry year, you might find that there's not enough moisture within obviously your soil profile or within your land for your actual seed to be able to germinate within 5 to 10 days after putting it down. So you might find your October 15 recipe of putting your maize seed down might not necessarily work well till we've received enough rainfalls, which in some instances can be as late as November or as late as December. And in some instances, only then would it be conducive for you to put down your maize. And that's obviously going to also have an impact in terms of the seed type which you put down. If you are only going to be able to plant much later in the season, it won't be worth your while to plant obviously a maize or a seed type which is going to obviously need anything between 160 days. So something which is going to take longer than 4 months. You've got to play it around in terms of looking at your condition of climate when it's conducive for you to plant. Is the seed type which you've got going to be conducive in terms of the amount of days it needs to mature and be ready to be harvested, or do you need to change? Something as well which I want to close with is we need to get out of this mindset of harvesting seed from the previous season and storing it back in order to plant it again, because that's obviously got a lot of deficiencies and a lot of disadvantages for us as farmers.
Thank you so much, Siyabonga. The value that I'm getting out of this session. So my next question is specifically on what you touched on, your last points that you made around the climate. What should we be considering in terms of, spoken about it? We can't be recipe farmers. Those were your words. So I think considering the impact of climate change and access to water, are there more resilient crops, especially when it comes to water access that farmers should be considering? What should we be thinking about? Dr. Lorato, would you like to take this one?
When it comes to climate resilient crops, there's a large amount of them in South Africa. Not to get too political, but in a lot of instances, the majority of them we import. There's quite a significant amount of these climate resilient crops that we import from your Netherlands, your America, etc., etc. And this is the time, given the impact that has been realized throughout the world, and especially in South Africa with regards to the impact of climate change. I think it's time that our government invests more in research pertaining to climate resilient crops. I recall one time I got a call from a farmer in KZN during the floods, and she asked me, "Do you have a potato?" She's a potato farmer that's supplying one of the big multinationals, and she asked, "Do you have potatoes flood tolerant, meaning that it can survive when there's flooding?" And I told her, "No, we don't. With the limited budget that we have, we are focusing on other stuff pertaining to potato breeding." But just to go back to your question, there are a lot of crops that are available. And like Siyabonga said, look at the climate and determine the type of cultivar or variety that you want to plant at that time, be it a long grower or a short grower. It all depends on what your observation informs you about the climatic conditions. Just recently, there were farmers that also planted maize and sunflower in the Northwest Province. And for some reason, there was flooding that took place in March, which is way out of the raining season, according to tradition. And they lost a vast majority of their production. The land, it was destroyed by flood. So, like going back to what Siyabonga said, look at your area, look at the different varieties. Like, for example, cabbage has 4 or 5 different varieties. You get your drumhead, which is a big variety, you get your curry. But visit these seed companies online, find out what's available to the farmers in terms of the varieties. I think we still have that listener in this space, Madubanye. He's a researcher working on grains, and they formed part of a consortium that worked on producing a drought-tolerant maize variety, a South African drought-tolerant maize variety, which is available to farmers. But when you interact with farmers, a lot of them don't know that these are available to them. They only know your mainstream, I don't want to call them by name, but they only know those mainstream maize seeds that are available. They have been taught about through tradition or from exposure. So there are cultivars that are tolerant, be it to drought, be it to the increasing pressure of diseases and pests. These cultivars are available to farmers. All that is needed is go online, check, visit the seed companies, and you can also drop me a DM on Twitter and I'll drop you a list depending on the type of crop you are looking into producing.
Thank you, Doc. I think just to come in as well, I'd like to respond to this question because I think in another perspective or angle, but perhaps advise our listeners or farmers of various strategies in which they can counteract the conditions which we encounter on a day-to-day basis based on climate change. And here I'm speaking mainly to the small-scale farmers or people with small holdings, or somebody with a plot or a garden which they work themselves. I think one of the aspects which need us to be climate smart in terms of the environment which we are faced with nowadays is farmers are either faced, or small scale farmers are either faced with a way of trying to conserve the moisture when there is rainfall or there has been appropriate moisture, strategies of trying to minimize it evaporating quickly before our plants or crops have been able to utilize it. And on the other hand, we need to develop or come up with strategies of ensuring that when we do have a crop out on the land and it happens to be that we've received more than enough rainfall, how do we go about ensuring that our soil profile is able to, over time, absorb or take in this moisture without damaging our crop, as well as without damaging our actual soil profile and eroding and leading to soil erosion and gullies and dongas? And how I always look at it when I think of small-scale farmers is wherever environments which we constantly see on a day-to-day basis people looking for places or areas to throw away grass which has either been brush cutted or slashed. Those are the sort of things which we need to start collecting and applying and ensuring that we apply it on the land and in between our crops to try and ensure that with whatever moisture we have within our soil profile, we try and reduce the amount at which evaporation takes place. Then what that will also do as well, it also buys a bit of time for our soil profiles to be able to have a bit more additional time to absorb water when there's additional water or moisture in order to buy time for the actual water to be infiltrated. So we've got to devise and come up with these strategies. Other type of aspect which we need to come into and decide on as farmers based on obviously the environmental conditions or the climatic conditions is obviously our plant population. You can't plant a high plant population if you know that obviously you're in an area or you're in a season where there's a restricted amount of moisture or rainfall is hard to come by, whereby you know that you're planting dry land. Hence, you've obviously got to reduce the pressure which your plants are going to put on your soil in terms of obtaining moisture or water, and vice versa. Obviously, if you've got a bit more water or you've obviously got the luxury of being able to irrigate, you can work on a bit more of an intensive plant population and plant your crops a bit closer to each other or a higher plant population per square meter or per hectare.
Thank you so much, Siyabonga. So my next question is specifically, and I think you've touched on it briefly now, Siyabonga, in terms of, just generic tips when it comes to irrigation, when you're growing your summer crops. And I think you have mentioned before the importance of cover crops. Dr. Lorato, would you maybe like to take this one?
Siyabonga mentioned using your cut grass for mulching to retain soil moisture. There's one instrument that I love using, and I love recommending that smallholder farmers utilize during the production, especially if they are still not that proficient when it comes to irrigation. The device is called a chameleon. And how this chameleon works is that you have a probe, you have a sensor. It's got three different probes. You dig the probes into the soil. Depending on the type of crop that you've planted, you will dig the probes into three different depths within the soil. For example, you would have one probe at 15 centimeters below the ground, one at 25 centimeters below the ground, and then another one at 35 or 40 centimeters below the ground. So those different probes are dug into the soil and you leave them there for the duration of your production cycle, that one cycle. And you would have your sensor. So your sensor has three colors that it shows. You have your red, you have your green, and you have your blue color. Blue means that your soil is oversaturated with water. And if it stays oversaturated for a long period of time, then you have salts that become high in the soil, depending obviously on the quality of your water. From there, you get also the green color, which means that you have sufficient water in your soil. And then red means obviously the soil is dry. And I always tell the farmers that don't panic every time you see a red color on the chameleon, because there's a point where red is good, meaning that you are giving your roots or your tubers under the ground time to breathe, because obviously you cannot breathe underwater. So with the plants, you need to allow a moment of dryness so that there's aeration that happens, meaning that there's a flow of air within the underground space. So I always recommend to farmers that when it comes to irrigation, if you can, and I'm talking about those that have larger production areas like 1 hectare and above, if you can invest in a chameleon, because it will help you a lot when it comes to monitoring water availability in the soil. And particularly those farmers that are currently struggling with irrigation systems. As I've visited a lot of farmers around the provinces, not all the farmers have functional irrigation systems, or some of them don't have water rights and they're still waiting for a prolonged period of time to get those water rights resolved for them to utilize the water that's available. Some of them are still waiting to put together resources to have boreholes drilled or refurbish the boreholes. So there's a whole lot of obstacles that are presented to these farmers when it comes to irrigation, and some of them opt to do dry land. So when you use the chameleon, it also assists you in monitoring the rainfall pattern. And because a lot of farmers, smallholder farmers, have not been taught on the importance of having a rain gauge in your production area and actually keeping records with regards to the rain that falls at a specific time, and how to keep records so that you are able to constantly have records that you can go back to, even though we are experiencing climate change, but the changes are happening in bits and pieces. It's not like drastic changes. So from my side, in addition to your mulching, etc., cover crops, the important thing is to have a way in which you'll be able to monitor the moisture, soil moisture.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lorato. Siyabonga, would you like to also contribute to this one? I think that the use of technology is becoming ever present, and I think this is definitely one method that I agree farmers can use. Siyabonga, your take on this question?
We need to obviously come up and constantly utilize strategies which are going to allow us to maximize the amount of moisture which we are able to obviously get. And I think obviously some of the things as well linked to irrigation, which are also critical, is that with the amount of money which we spend on fertilizer and the importance of fertilizer or nutrient application, especially with our inorganic fertilizers, it also becomes critical that we are able to ensure that we supplement it with an appropriate amount of moisture to ensure that the plants are able to take it up, because there's a lot of losses which are incurred if we apply fertilizer placed in a vulnerable state and exposed to the natural elements. There's not appropriate moisture quantity applied at that time to be able to allow it to dissolve, and it's exposed to natural elements and various aspects such as volatilization, and you're applying fertilizer, but due to obviously water not being appropriate or applied in the appropriate manner, you're not seeing the results of the fertilizer which you are putting down to your lands, and you remain concerned as a farmer with the amount you spend, but you're not seeing the results.
Thank you so much. I've covered most of the aspect that I thought was important. And maybe we should just go towards, the best cultivars for the season. I don't know if you guys want to maybe just suggest a few. What should farmers keep top of mind? And then my last question is just general tips when it comes to marketing, of summer crops. I think that's one of the aspects that Dr. Lerato said earlier in the session. The marketing and finding the market is really important. So just those are my last two questions.
I would certainly, I think you also stated it, and it plays a big role in a lot of our households as being a staple diet. I'd definitely go for maize at this time of the season or year. Obviously, depending on whether you are keen on harvesting it as green millies or you're going to let it out grow and have a reduced moisture content, so harvest it as dry grain in the later stages. Obviously, getting a good quality seed cultivar or maize cultivar, that will always play an important role. In most instances, buying certified seed which has been tried and tested, that will obviously give you good results. And next choice as well, critical one, which I think becomes also quite significant, would be choosing a crop from the pumpkin family, either pumpkins or butternut. Just also being careful with that one, especially if you've got exposure or resource of water, not to overdo it with the water, as obviously there's a lot of diseases and pests which can develop if overdone, things such as your powdery mildew and so forth.
Thanks so much, Siyabonga. So I'm going to wrap up. Siyabonga, just last comments from your side as we wrap up.
Thank you to everyone, obviously, who joined. I think just to be successful in terms of the summer crop, whatever you do, plan appropriately and implement it accordingly. And if it calls for you to change your game plan, do so. And remember, we shouldn't be fighting with the natural resources, but working hand in hand with it in order to bring the best results and to ensure that we remain a food secure South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much to my amazing speakers this evening. I really appreciate it. I'm sorry that I can't get the last word from Dr. Lorato this evening. From myself, your host, Dawn Numdu, have a great evening further and all the best with the summer season and farming here in South Africa. Thank you so much. Have a great evening.